Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Wild Mind, which introduces a holistic and integral ecology of the human psyche that encompasses the best insights of existing Western psychologies, but also stretches far beyond them, reconnecting and resourcing humans with what is inherently right and inspiring. That's what we'll be talking about today as we talk with our guest who has spent more than 17 years as a therapist and wilderness guide. She likes to utilize her training and experience with yoga, Hakomi, and somatic psychotherapy in her private practice. She also leads programs with Animas Valley Institute and the Sora Yoga Institute, and also created Wild Yoga, which is a sacred aligning of soul and earth. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our special guest, Rebecca Wildbear. Rebecca, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you. Good to be here with you.
Now, talk about what rewilding psychology is and why people would be interested in pursuing something like this in their lives.
Well, rewilding psychology builds on the innate resources and abilities that we already have in us that either haven't been cultivated or we're not connected to, and also connects us to nature, which is also, really already connected to us and a great resource to us.
Now, I noticed something about subpersonalities. What exactly is that meant by something like that?
These subpersonalities are the parts of ourselves that can operate or run the show in our psyche, and actually commonly do, I think, in a culture like ours that isn't a healthy and one that's connected to the wild. The subpersonalities are the ones of us that are trying to do their very best to make things happen, to get things done, to orient ourselves, but really they are fragmented. They only have very limited ways of dealing with things. The subpersonalities, in Bill's book, he mentions 4, and like the loyal soldiers are, there's a whole story in his books about where that word comes from, but in general, they're often the ones that are trying to run the show by keeping us safe, by keeping us small, by keeping things the same as they've always been, pretty fear-based, and often critical of ourselves. Sometimes they can also flatter us, but they're operating more to keep things the same and afraid of anything being different, even if things aren't so good. And there's also the escapists, the wounded children, and the shadow parts of ourselves are unconscious. So when we're not in our wholeness, when we're not in our wild mind, it's the sub-personalities that are running the show.
Now, you developed what is known as wild yoga. That sounds pretty wild in and of itself. What is that all about?
Wild yoga is a way of being connected to our wholeness, being connected to our soul, and at the same time being connected to the vastness and the larger wild world. And to be really living in a place where we're feeling who we really are at the deepest level, and we're also connected to the world at the deepest level. And yoga is, obviously indicates that we're very much in our bodies. And, as well as being in our bodies, we're fully in our emotional selves, we're fully in our imaginal selves, we're fully in our sensing body, very alive. And that's actually... I've done wild yoga programs on what we'll talk about, the 4 facets of our wholeness. Mm-hmm. So using wild yoga as a practice for a way to connect to all the facets of ourself or our wholeness and help them become stronger.
So I would imagine the approach is to allow people to really discover their authenticity, who they actually really know they are rather than who they believe they are. Is that how it works?
Yeah, I would say that's a very good way of putting it. And ultimately, Animas's work is helps us know who we are authentically at a soul level, which is even a level deeper than the personality level.
Now, when people come to you, have they tried conventional ways, I guess, of trying to, discover themselves, and it just didn't seem to be working?
Yeah, I would say people come when they're, oftentimes when they're, when things are happening and they're feeling, well, they come at different, at different times. Sometimes when people feel stuck, I would say like, there's more to life than the life I've been living, and yet I'm not quite sure how to connect to it, how to get there. And yet at the same time, I feel like the life I've been living, it's kind of dead. It's old. It's stale. It's not alive. It's not happening. It's ready to be let go of, and there's something else calling. And then I would say sometimes people may become when the life that's calling has already started to appear in dreams, in experiences on the land, in imaginative ways, and yet they can't quite make sense of it, and they need support in how to decipher the code or to just continue to be in relationship with the pieces that are coming, and how to continue to track the threads.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned earlier about the 4 facets of the self. What exactly are we talking about here?
Well, the 4 facets of the self, Bill created, connected to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. And that's pretty common with traditions around the world, using a map like that on the directions to help us connect. The directions have often been used before, in terms of the seasons, in terms of times of day. And Bill utilized it in this map. It's actually a great way to track and connect with it, and it's also a great way for it to be connected to the earth and nature. But there's 4 facets of the self, and sometimes this part, the fragmented selves in some ways can be easier to connect to when we talk about them, because they're like, oh yeah, I know my loyal soldier, yeah, it's always doing this and that and saying this and that. And the aspects of our wholeness or of ourself can be a bit harder to connect to, and that's a lot what we focus on in developing practices to help these parts grow stronger. But the north facet is called the nurturing generative adult. And since I mentioned the loyal soldier, I'll just say it lives in the north, just like the loyal soldier lives in the north. Our loyal soldier is our fragmented part that's trying to be an adult. But it often does so in harmful ways, maybe ways we learned as a child or in the culture, ways that can be critical or driven or egocentric. And the nurturing generative adult is the north facet of ourself that supports our well-being and the well-being of others in the web of life, other people, the earth. And it's also nurturing because it's loving, generative because it can produce, it can make things happen, but it happens in a way that's more natural, not the way that sometimes in our culture, are driven to have to produce or accomplish. It happens more out of, like you said, our authenticity, a naturalness of us being ourselves and coming from that loving place. And so that's the north facet. The south facet is one that is really connected to nature. We call it the wild indigenous one. And that actually connects to our animal nature, our playful nature, our emotional nature that has always known itself as a human animal among all the other animals on the earth. When we're our wild indigenous self, we can have all of our emotions. We can actually feel that we are connected to the river, mountain, deserts, forest. If you've ever heard of the archetype of the Green Man or Artemis, Lady of the Beast, the wild indigenous one is of that. I almost think of it as the one we'd be if we were, raised by coyotes and just allowed to, live in the wild and be one with the wild. And we grew up to be, a young person, a young adult, who we naturally would become, would be that wild indigenous one, just totally at home in our bodies and in nature.
Would it be fair to say that the approach also has an element of rites, such as rites of passage?
Yeah, I would say that you mean as far as Animus's work
Yes.
or the Animus's work, definitely I would say that's the case. Bill's other book, if you've read Nature and the Human Soul, talks about our passages from one stage to the other as humans as we grow and evolve. And oftentimes it is important to do ceremony, to be in ceremony. And, one thing we do is quests where people can fast and be on solo, which is one form of ceremony. And rites of passage can be a good way to mark transitions from one stage to the next, or at least allow an openness in our conversation with nature. If it feels that we're about to shift in our lives from one stage to another, we can have a ceremony to allow that to happen or move in that direction if that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's just so interesting when you think of people today that always talk about how they love being in the outdoors, they love being in nature, but it seems that people, here they are, but then they're running around in the woods with their cell phones, and they just don't seem very connected to what's going on there. Hopefully you don't allow any technology during your retreats, that people really have to be of and in the land quite a bit. Do they find themselves at certain points, depending on how long it is, kind of feeling a little agitated, like they don't know what to do or how to relax?
I would say definitely difficult things can come up on the experiences. Sometimes people feel, and sometimes the opposite happens. People feel so connected to themselves and so connected to the world that they get nervous about leaving the program and how they're going to manage when there are cell phones and there are all the distractions that our culture provides, and how they're going to be able to maintain the things that they've discovered in the time that we've had together. But yeah, sometimes agitations can come up. The things that you're talking about, cell phone addictions and things like that are so prevalent in our culture and really just easy to be a part of is actually one of the facets of our fragmented self we call the escapist, which generally wants to avoid and escape anything challenging, difficult, even sometimes things that are wondrous inside of us because they're so different. And so when we do take space from those things and allow ourselves to be in the deeper conversations, a lot can emerge. So anything can happen. Sometimes it can create anxiety or nervousness about what's happening or what will happen, and sometimes it can be just so incredibly lovely that, it's hard to wonder how to keep it going on.
It's just so amazing to think about developing wild mind, because it seems people really want to be very authentic in who they are and how they express themselves. But we sometimes feel that there is an outside pressure that tells us we should be doing something different. We know, inherently that that's not, true, and it kind of adds a lot of aggravation to our makeup. And something like this really sort of changes the field for a lot of people, doesn't it?
I would say yes, it really does. I mean, that's one of the reasons I love the work, is it really has the potential to shift people, and it's kind of what we need in the culture. Like you said, it's not only just our own minds that can have these loyal soldiers driving us to be a particular way that isn't really how we feel called to be, but actually there's, I would say cultural loyal soldiers that sort of say, that are in our own head but in the whole culture, that this is how we're supposed to be and this is what we're supposed to do. And ultimately our culture is not a real healthy one at the moment. We need a cultural transformation as much as we need individual transformation. And the one thing is that they're connected. As we as individuals are able to transform inside of our own minds and reconnect with our wholeness and reconnect with our soul, which also inspires our artistry or our truest giveaway, we can get out of the patterns of being trapped in the prison of just continuing to operate in the way our culture has set up that aren't healthy.
Now, as people consider something like this, going out to a retreat to cultivate a wild mind, do they also find themselves, kind of really beginning to question the ways they went about doing things most of their lives?
Oh yeah, I would say that's definitely true. But I would say that sometimes it can come with an understanding of one of the things with the loyal soldier, which is usually the way that's kept us in our habitual way of interacting, as well as the other aspects of our fragmented parts, is there can be compassion and understanding, because it's usually connected to our wounds or whatever the difficult situation that we were raised in, that we did the best we could given the situation that we were in, and made the most of things to get to be to arrive where we are now. But at the same time, it can bring up huge amounts of grief for years of lost connection to the earth and to one's deepest self, and how it might have been if we were raised in a society where our self was cultivated, where you didn't need to go to a program when you're 50 years old to cultivate yourself, because it was something that you were taught when you were 5.
So what really happens at this wild mind retreat? What do people actually participate in doing?
Well, there's a lot of practices around developing your wholeness. So I briefly described to you a little bit about the North Facet and the South Facet, but there's also the East and West Facet, which I would say in our culture can be even a little more challenging or unique to connect to or understand. And we spend time understanding what those facets are. We spend time in experiences in the natural world to help those parts go stronger. We spend time becoming more aware of the fragmented parts and how, which ones have been most active in our lives and how do we, when we get what we call it hijacked by the fragmented selves, we can have a great awareness of our wholeness, and then all of a sudden something happens, scary, unfamiliar, traumatic, and the fragmented selves hijack us because they're used to running things. How do you deal with that, and how do you bring yourself back into your wholeness, and so that you can respond to life from that place? I was
going to say that it sounds to me also that you really teach people, or at least guide them to learning to live in the present moment, which is a gift in and of itself.
Oh yeah, I would say that's very true. That's actually the resource place of the East Facet, the innocent sage, is very present moment and present centered. And in fact, I would say all of the facets of the self have that too. The South, which is in the wild. So yeah, definitely a big part of being connected to the wholeness is being in the moment, in the present, and not in the story of the old wounds or old stuff or old fears.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like a lot of excitement goes on during a retreat like this, doesn't it?
I would say that's the case. Yeah, I would say it's a very deep and exciting time, rich time.
And when people attend and go through this retreat, what kind of changes do you tend to see them experience that perhaps they're not used to?
Well, I would say that some of the things that we see happening would be, I would say oftentimes people notice that they've actually been living their life hijacked by their fragmented parts, and more of the time than they would have considered. And they notice it. They're aware, like, wow, I can't believe that's really what's been happening. And they also come into even if they've read a Wild Mind Bill's book, in doing the experiential practices, they come into a deeper sense of really what they are and how they can connect to them, and the particular way it is for them. It's not very programmed like the North Facet is always like this. It's a very intimate experience. So each person's facet of self is very unique to them and very unique to their relationship to the land, and they come into their own visceral, physical feeling of it, of each one and all together. And it also, this experience seeds the potential for the journey. Sometimes people who've already done Animist programs come on these programs, and And also, I would say even more commonly, this program can be a great one to start with if you haven't done any other programs. But it seeds or supports, if other people have already done animist programs, but often it seeds the potential for the conversation with soul, which, that conversation with our soul, with our mysterious self, doesn't really usually arise or get heard until there's enough of a base of resource within ourselves for it to show up on the scene. So sometimes those kinds of conversations, soul encounters, can even be happening in a wild mind program.
As I'm on your website, which is RebeccaWildbear.com, correct?
Mm-hmm, that's correct.
It's pretty interesting because I'm looking at some of the soulcraft practices, and one of them includes talking across the species boundaries. What is that exactly?
Great question. Well, it's kind of like it sounds. You're actually talking to trees, rocks, the sky, animals, the river, whoever, and wherever you feel inspired to. And this might feel, this might sound bizarre to you if it's never been done before. Interestingly, I did it as a child until I learned that we weren't supposed to do it anymore, and then I stopped. But usually, in most of our lives, humans did talk to the earth. In most of the hundreds and hundreds of years that people have lived with the earth, they've talked to the earth. And it's only in more recent years that seemed like a really bizarre and strange thing to do. And so we actually encourage people to reconnect with having a conversation with the land. And, you can have a conversation in many ways. It doesn't always have to be words. It can be a silence, movement, song. But often it's actually really potent to utilize language, because that's one of our primary ways of communicating, to have a conversation. And also sometimes we can hear things back, and people are like, "What? Are you crazy?" And it's really opening up to our imagination. And a lot of times people say, "Just your imagination." Well, that's just your imagination. But really, our imagination is a very potent way of experiencing the world. And I would say on some levels it's even more powerful than thinking, which is the major mode that gets a lot of credence and credit in our culture, that, if I think, therefore I am. If there's a problem, I'm going to think my way out of it. Thinking is the modality we rely on. That, actually we overthink a lot, and that gets us into trouble. But really the other... We talk about 4 windows of knowing, but the other 3, emotions, sensations, and imagination. And the most potent, I think, being imagination, is a very powerful way of experiencing the world. So, likely when we're to go have a conversation with nature, if we've never done it before, the loyal soldier is going to come in and say, "What are you doing? This is crazy," or "This is just your imagination." And, we definitely encourage people to let your imagination run wild, and to have a conversation with trees, rocks, and the river, and all sorts of potent understandings, ways of experiencing oneself and of knowing the world shift in those kinds of conversations.
I like, Rebecca, that you talked about how we tend to live in a day and an age where many of us think too much, that we rely on that, I guess, natural resource, if you will, too much, and it's so common that a lot of the stress that we tend to take on occurs from being in mostly the beta state of mind, that state. And I can see from a lot of what you put here on your website about what people experience. For instance, as we were just talking about, talking across the species boundaries is one of those things that you have as part of this program, that you begin activating other areas of the mind that people aren't used to using more regularly, such as alpha and theta, which goes into the deep imagination and perhaps even reaches into the soul. And you can see where sometimes, I guess, a person can feel lost and disconnected from who they are authentically because we're too in the logic, linear beta state of thinking rather than being in the imagination. And I like that. I also see that, that you have a sort of a soul-centric dream work. Describe what that is exactly and how it can actually help people to open up this imagination that you're talking about.
Yeah, great. Thanks for asking, Daniel. And I think what you're saying just first is a great point because it actually highlights one of the things that is most important about all of the Animist programs, including Wild Mind, is that we do something that I would call shift consciousness. And our consciousness is often in like what you're calling the beta state, the thinking mind. You might call it chronos, linear time. And we try to shift consciousness to a different place, to more of an earth time, and a time where things can just appear in our imagination, in our emotion. We can be surprised, and it's that shift in consciousness that allows a different conversation to us to open up to the world that it wants to converse with us and what it wants to show up, how it wants to show up to us. And when we're in Chronos time, it can still pop in there, but we're so filled with our plan and what's to do next that it's hard for the other world to reveal itself as when we shift our consciousness and open up. And the dream world is definitely another way that we do that, working with dream images. So when we're in the night world, that is actually our imagination too, playing, and in some ways we can give it more credence because the ego's not involved at all. We're completely asleep, and these images just show up. But a lot of times, there's ways we can go so much more into our dreams than we do. We have these amazing dreams sometimes, and sometimes we're not connected to our dreams. We also work with people to get connected if they're not remembering their dreams. Everyone dreams, and everyone can remember their dreams. And sometimes we have dreams and we don't know what to do. They're so amazing. They're so interesting. And we do a lot of practices which actually support our West facet of self, the Muse Beloved, with connecting to how to say yes to the dreams, believing that everything in the dream, all the beings, even nightmares, are guides trying to support our becoming at the deepest level. And how can we say yes to what the dream maker wants us to experience? So we do a lot of practices to have people actually do that, to experientially say yes to the dream time and the particular dreams that are coming to them.
Mm-hmm. Not to mention befriending the night.
Yep, another West practice, the befriending the dark. The dark is the mystery. When it's dark, everything's a mystery. We can't see anything. And so it offers a lot of opportunity for things to arise.
What an exciting program. And people can find out more by visiting you at your website, which is? You named my website personally already, but also you can log on to Animist's website, animist.org. And you'll be able to see where the Wild Mind programs are scheduled, and also you'll be able to see about the other Animist programs that are offered too. Very good. Well, Rebecca Wildbear, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. It's about time many of us got reconnected in nature and began to activate those imaginations and our soul, which we were all born to do. Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. You bet. And again, the website is RebeccaWildbear.com. We want to thank you for being on the program today. It's been a pleasure. Okay, thank you. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You can also find out more by visiting us at Beyond50Radio.com, and also follow us on Twitter, where you get all the updates to find out what's going on the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past.